The year is 1912. Theodore Roosevelt is running for President of the United States. As he is about to give a campaign speech, he is shot by a foreigner who believes that Roosevelt is trying to set up a monarchy in America. Roosevelt only survived because the bullet hit the script and the glasses case in his shirt. He then astounded the audience by giving his speech in the blood-stained shirt, shouting that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. On the river of doubt, how much more it took would be put to the test. Hello and welcome to Random History. It's codename Hannibal, ready to do our first episode on the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. When it became clear that William Howard Taft would be the Republican representative in the 1912 elections, Roosevelt ditched them and joined the Progressive Party. He then suffered an embarrassing political defeat, having split the Republican vote and giving the office to the Democrat representative Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt retreated to his home at Sagamore Hill to recover. One of the few friends that stuck with him during this time was a priest named Father Zahm. While most priests of the time hated science and Darwinism and considered them enemies of religion, Father Zahm embraced them, saying that they helped explain some things that religion did not, and religion explained some things that they did not. Science and religion should be partners, he said, not enemies. Remember Father Zahm. We'll get back to him later. One day, Theodore Roosevelt got an invitation from an institution in Argentina called the Mueso Social. The Mueso Social wanted Roosevelt to be a guest lecturer for them, and they offered to let him decide the terms of his visit. They also offered to pay him an equivalent of over $300,000 in today's money. But perhaps the biggest reason that Roosevelt would eventually accept the invitation was because his son, Kermit Roosevelt, was currently working in South America. Remember Father Zahm? Because he's about to become an important character again. After he had been on an expedition to South America in 1907, he had always wanted to return, and he wanted Theodore Roosevelt to be his traveling companion. Many times he had tried to convince Theodore Roosevelt to join him, but Theodore had always been too busy. But now, already about to go to South America, Roosevelt finally agreed. The plan was to first sail down the Rio Negro and then the Orinoco River into the Atlantic Ocean. Though the areas were sparsely populated, they were already explored and charted. Sailing down them would require little or no risk. Despite this, Henry Fairfield Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History, decided to send two skilled naturalists with Roosevelt to ensure his safety. If Roosevelt was injured or killed, it would reflect horribly upon the museum. The two naturalists were named George Cherry and Leo Miller. In the meantime, Father Zahm set about preparing for the expedition, but the man he put in charge of packing was a strange choice. 10 years before, in 1903, Antony Fiala had co-led an expedition to the North Pole. What happened was a cautionary tale for explorers. I'd love to get into more detail, and hopefully I'll get to sometime, but for now suffice it to say, it was a disaster. The men were stranded for 2 years, only surviving because of some good luck on their part and some bad luck on the part of a couple whales and walruses. When at last Fiala returned to civilization, he was scorned by his fellow explorers and scientists. One of them wrote that he may be a fairly good cook, but not a leader of men. However, Zahm still placed him in charge of preparing for the expedition. Knowing that the ex-president of the United States was going on the trip, Fiala was very precise about what to pack. He even sent Roosevelt 5 flavors of tea, asking which one of them Roosevelt would prefer to have on the expedition. These ridiculous luxuries, taking the place of needed necessities, would cause a huge problem on the River of Doubt. Meanwhile, in South America, Kermit had recently become engaged to a woman named Belle Willard, and he wanted to leave for Europe as soon as he could to join her. But Edith Roosevelt urged him to accompany his father on the expedition. Theodore was known to attempt the most difficult things in everything he did, and Edith was worried that if he attempted that on this trip, he might not come home. As of then, the plan was not dangerous. But all that was about to change. The Brazilian government wished to provide Roosevelt with the best possible guide they could think of. This was a man named Cândido Rondon. Roosevelt would later rate Rondon as one of the 4 best explorers of the time, and though this was the early 20th century, which produced some of the most famous names in exploration, few would argue with him. Colonel Cândido Mariano da Silva Rondon was 48 and had been born in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. Rondon was born in the same year that the War of the Triple Alliance, a bloody conflict that tore apart southern South America, began. Both of his parents died of smallpox, his father 6 months before he was born, and his mother 2 years after his birth. He lived with his grandparents and then moved to Rio de Janeiro when he was 16. He joined the military academy, where he was respected for his discipline and teased for his poverty and poor social skills. He defended the rights of Brazil's native people, being partly descended from one of them himself, and soon joined the popular positivists movement. As he grew up, he was made the head of the Strategic Telegraph Commission and became famous, or rather infamous, for the brutal conditions he and his men were constantly working in, at one point losing 41 out of 71 men. That was extreme. However, serving with Rondon still became a punishment for criminals that the government did not want to spend the money on keeping in prison. Wild animals, hostile natives, diseases, and the other countless dangers of the rainforest were ever present and ever threatening. Despite his incredibly high fatality rates, Rondon became one of the most famous and most successful explorers in Brazilian history. And so, despite his high fatality rates, it was him that the Brazilian government asked to accompany Theodore Roosevelt. But Rondon had no intention of being a tour guide or part of a hunting expedition. If he was going on an expedition, it would be one of exploration. And so, the Brazilian government returned to Roosevelt, asking if he would like to explore an unexplored river. They didn't even need to ask. And so it was that the River of Doubt expedition began. You see, many years before, Rondon had been working with the Telegraph Commission when he discovered the beginning of an unknown river. Not having the time to explore it, he appropriately named it the Rio da Duvida, the River of Doubt. He had always wanted to return, and now, here was a golden opportunity. But before they got to the River of Doubt, they had to make a grueling overland journey across Brazil, with their beasts of burden dropping their packs or dying. The only places to stop and refill were towns that at first glance appeared to be a victory of man over nature. But once you looked deeper, it was clear the victory was Pyrrhic. As the explorers struggled across Brazil, it became clear that their team would need some serious cuts. It had always been clear that Father Zam was no explorer, but for a while, the expedition members had believed that he would not be such a harm to the trip. However, when Zam started making racist comments about the camaradas, basically the Brazilian equivalent of cowboys and the ones who would make up the muscle on the River of Doubt expedition, and started demanding that he be carried on a stretcher by 4 strong natives, the normally calm Rondon blew his top, and the normally headstrong Roosevelt just told them that, yeah, you should probably listen to Rondon and get the heck out of here. Zam obliged. The expedition members probably celebrated when Zam left, but the next person to have to leave was a much more tragic story. Antony Fiala, who had wished to join this expedition in order to redeem himself in the eyes of his fellow scientists, was again found to be too incompetent for this kind of journeying, and he, too, was eventually forced to leave. One final cut was made when the explorers, tired and already low on food, reached the beginning of the Rio da Duvida. They decided that having 2 naturalists was a luxury that they could not afford. Leo Miller, knowing that George Cherry, older and more experienced, was the better man for the trip, sadly agreed to leave the expedition. Now, let's review. On one side, we have the toughest men of their time: Theodore Roosevelt, Candido Rondon, George Cherry, the camaradas. As they slowly made their way toward the River of Doubt, they traded stories about their past heroics. Theodore's adventures in the Dakota Territory and charging up San Juan Hill. Rondon's tales of surviving ambushes by hostile natives. But it wasn't just the expedition leaders telling great tales. George Cherry had some of the most exciting in the group. One of them was about how around the turn of the century, he had been fighting in Mexico. He had been part of a group of only 5 men, being attacked by 20 cavalry. He especially remembered the terrifying and demoralizing psychological effect that the lances had had on him. And yet, his group stayed firm and continued firing until half the cavalry were dead. They then escaped without losing a single man. Certainly, people who had survived such incredibly dangerous situations as these could survive some trip down a river. Join us next time to see if that statement is true, as the explorers finally make it to the beginning of the River of Doubt. Waiting for them will be the same dangers that made Rondon's earlier journeys so deadly, and more. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and Random History will be back hopefully next week.